The evening sky glowed with shades of gold and purple as the sun slipped behind the city skyline. In one of the richest neighborhoods, a grand mansion stood tall, its wide windows glowing with warm light. Expensive cars lined the driveway, sleek black sedans, polished sports cars, and limousines. Each vehicle carried important guests who had come to spend the evening with the millionaire who lived there. Inside, the mansion was a world of luxury. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above polished marble floors. Golden frames held paintings worth more than most people's homes. The long dining table shone with silverware and glass goblets that glittered under the lights. The air was filled with the soft notes of classical music playing from hidden speakers, blending with the hum of laughter and conversation. Wealthy guests moved from room to room, their voices filled with cheer. Women wore elegant dresses, diamonds flashing around their necks. Men laughed loudly, holding glasses of wine, discussing business deals, vacations, and stocks. It was the kind of gathering where everyone wanted to be seen, where every detail showed off just how rich the host was. The millionaire himself stood at the center, surrounded by friends. He was tall, dressed in a fine suit that fit perfectly. His smile was wide, his laugh booming. He enjoyed the attention, the admiration, the way people leaned closer when he spoke. This was his world, his kingdom, and tonight was just another chance to prove how high he stood above others. But behind the shining world of crystal and gold, quiet workers moved silently. Waiters in black vests carried trays of drinks. Chefs in white coats brought out steaming dishes from the kitchen, and among them was the maid. She wore a simple uniform, her dark hair tied neatly back. Her steps were soft, her presence barely noticed as she collected empty glasses and placed fresh ones on tables. Most guests didn't look at her twice. She was part of the background, like the furniture or the paintings, useful but invisible. To them, the night was about glamour, not about the people who worked in the shadows to make it all run smoothly. The music played on, the laughter grew louder, and the night felt endless. The millionaire raised his glass, toasting to success, to wealth, to another year of greatness. Everyone clapped and cheered, their voices filling the grand hall. The maid moved carefully along the edges of the room, her eyes lowered, focused on her work. She knew her place, silent, efficient, unnoticed. She had heard their conversations, their careless jokes, their endless talk about money and power. She carried herself with dignity, but inside she felt the distance between their world and hers, like a heavy wall. Yet as the evening went on, a shift began to form. Some guests grew restless. They had eaten the expensive food, they had praised the mansion, but now they wanted something more. Entertainment, something to keep the night alive. The millionaire, always eager to impress, looked around the room. He wanted to surprise his guests, to make them laugh, to remind them that his gatherings were never ordinary. His eyes landed on the corner of the room, where the grand piano sat polished and silent. The piano was beautiful, its black surface shining under the chandelier lights. It stood like a piece of art, untouched most nights, there only to remind visitors of elegance. The millionaire grinned. Perhaps the piano could give them the fun they wanted. And then his gaze shifted, past the polished keys, past the wealthy guests, to the maid standing nearby, holding an empty tray. The thought came quickly, without hesitation. He smirked, lifted his glass, and raised his voice above the chatter. "You there," he called out casually, pointing at her. "Come play us something on the piano, for amusement." The room burst into chuckles. Some guests laughed openly, nudging each other. Others smiled, waiting to see what would happen. The idea of the maid sitting at the grand piano seemed absurd, even funny. They expected clumsy hands, broken notes, something to laugh at before returning to their drinks. The maid froze, her tray pressed against her chest. Her eyes flicked to the millionaire, then to the piano, then back again. Heat rose to her cheeks as she realized every eye in the room was on her. She wasn't supposed to be the center of attention. She wasn't supposed to be part of their world. The laughter around her grew, light but sharp, pressing her into the moment. The millionaire waved his hand, still smirking. "Go on. Let's see what you've got. Entertain us." The maid took a slow breath. Her heart pounded. Her hands trembled slightly. She had never been asked for this. Not here. Not like this. For a moment, she thought of refusing, of shaking her head and walking away. But something inside her shifted. She placed the tray down on a nearby table, straightened her back, and slowly walked toward the piano. The room quieted, laughter fading into whispers. The guests leaned forward, curious now, waiting for the show. None of them knew that the maid carried more than tray and glasses. She carried a secret, a gift no one had expected. And when her fingers touched the keys, everything about the evening would change. The grand mansion sparkled like a palace. Golden light from the chandeliers fell across the marble floors, bouncing off glass walls and polished silver trays. Everywhere, the signs of wealth shone like stars, expensive jewelry on guests' wrists, laughter spilling from mouths that had never known hunger, and champagne glasses filled again and again. Yet behind the glitter and glamour, in the quiet corners of the room, there were people whose presence was hardly noticed. The waiters, the cooks, the maids. They moved like shadows, silent and steady, carrying food, clearing plates, refilling glasses. Their work kept the party alive, but no one celebrated them. Among them was the maid. She wore a simple black uniform, freshly pressed but modest. Her apron was tied neatly at her waist, her dark hair pulled back into a bun to keep it out of her face. She held herself with quiet dignity, though her steps were soft, her eyes lowered. To the guests, she was not a person. They saw only the tray in her hands, the glass of water she carried, the napkin she placed. She walked along the edge of the crowded room, careful not to draw attention. She had mastered the art of moving invisibly, of slipping between groups without disturbing them. She had worked in this mansion long enough to know her place. In the background, always present but never seen. And yet, she saw everything. She saw the wealthy women laughing as they compared jewelry, the way their diamond rings caught the light like fire. She saw the men boasting about business deals, their words sharp, their laughter louder than the music. She saw how easily they dismissed the staff, snapping fingers for more drinks without a second thought, never looking into the eyes of the person who brought them. It was not anger that filled her heart as she watched. It was something quieter, something heavier, a deep awareness of the distance between their world and hers. She had come to terms with it long ago, but every party reminded her of the invisible line she could never cross. Still, she worked with grace. She collected empty glasses and placed new ones without spilling a drop. She straightened plates and napkins as though each detail mattered. She moved with a rhythm that made her seem part of the background music itself. But inside, she carried secrets. The guests saw only her uniform, but they did not know her story. They did not know the long days she worked, the nights she returned to a small apartment at the edge of the city, where she lived simply, carefully saving what little she earned. They did not know about her mother, whose health had been fragile for years, or her younger brother, who dreamed of going to school but needed her support. And most of all, they did not know about her gift. In the silence of her room, when the world was asleep, she played the piano. It had started when she was a child, long before she became a maid. A neighbor had owned an old, broken piano, and while others ignored it, she had pressed its keys with wonder. The music spoke to her in a way words never could. Even now, after long shifts, she sometimes found her way to an old church nearby, where a kind priest allowed her to play on their piano. There, she let her fingers dance, pouring her feelings into melodies no one else ever heard. But in the mansion, she kept this part of herself hidden. Her role was to serve, not to be seen. As the party went on, she continued her work, carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres, offering small smiles to the few guests who looked her way, bowing her head when spoken to. But she noticed the small details others missed. The boredom settling over the crowd, the way some guests tapped their fingers restlessly, waiting for something new, something entertaining. The millionaire was laughing loudly in the center of the room, raising his glass higher with every toast. He was in his element, basking in the admiration of his guests. Yet she could see the way his eyes flicked around, searching for the next spark, the next show that would keep everyone impressed. And then his gaze landed on her. She felt it instantly. It was like a spotlight turning, suddenly pulling her from the shadows into the center. Her hands tightened around the tray she carried. She kept her eyes lowered, praying he would look away, but he didn't. Instead, his lips curved into a sly grin. "You there?" he called out, his voice carrying above the chatter. "Yes, you. Come here." Every head turned. The guests paused their conversations, curious. The maid froze for a moment before stepping forward, her heart beating faster. She wasn't used to being singled out in front of everyone. Her place was to remain unnoticed. But tonight, that would change. The millionaire chuckled, gesturing toward the grand piano that stood in the corner, shining under the chandelier's glow. "Why don't you play us something? For amusement." The room erupted with light laughter. Some guests smirked, whispering to one another. To them, it was a joke, a servant playing the piano for their entertainment. They expected nothing but clumsy fingers and broken notes, something to laugh about later. The maid stood still, her cheeks burning, her eyes flicking between the piano and the sea of faces waiting. She wanted to disappear, to me, pulled back into the shadows. But something inside her stirred, a quiet voice reminding her of who she really was. She placed the tray on a nearby table, her movements calm but deliberate. And slowly, with her heart pounding, she began to walk toward the piano. The laughter softened, replaced by murmurs. Curiosity filled the air. No one expected what was about to happen. The maid, invisible until now, was about to show them a part of herself they had never imagined. The party had reached its peak. The chandelier above glittered like 1,000 stars, reflecting in the wine glasses held high by the guests. Laughter rolled across the grand hall, bouncing off marble walls and echoing through the corridors of the mansion. The millionaire sat in the center of it all, his chair slightly elevated as though it were a throne. His friends leaned in close, eager to catch his words, eager to laugh when he laughed. But under the surface of all this glamour, a shadow of boredom was beginning to settle. The expensive food had been eaten, the best wine had been poured, the guests had admired the paintings, the sculptures, the shining luxury of the house. Now, as conversations repeated and voices grew heavy, the room needed something new, something entertaining. The millionaire noticed. He was used to reading the mood of a crowd, used to finding ways to keep their admiration. After all, his parties weren't just parties. They were performances, reminders of his wealth and influence. Every detail was designed to impress. He could not allow the night to grow dull. His eyes scanned the room. The violinist had already played her set. The staff continued their silent work, slipping through the hall with trays of drinks and plates of desserts. And then his gaze stopped, on the grand piano in the corner. It stood tall and polished, its surface shining black under the golden lights. It hadn't been touched all evening. To the guests, it was just decoration, a symbol of refinement. But to the millionaire, it was an idea, a spark. And then his eyes shifted again, past the polished piano, past the glittering guests, to the maid standing quietly near the wall. She was carrying an empty tray, her head slightly bowed, her dark uniform blending into the background. She looked like she always did, silent, invisible, unimportant. A slow grin spread across his face. He lifted his glass and raised his voice, letting it cut through the chatter. "You there," he called, his finger pointing toward her. "Yes, you?" The maid. Every head turned. The room fell into a hush, curiosity stirring. The maid froze, her eyes widening as she realized every gaze had landed on her. The millionaire chuckled, gesturing casually toward the piano. "Why don't you play us something? For amusement." For a heartbeat, silence hung in the room. And then came the laughter. It wasn't cruel at first, just amused, careless chuckles rolling out of the guests. Some exchanged glances, grinning as if they were in on a private joke. Others leaned back in their chairs, eager to watch what would happen next. A few even clapped their hands lightly, encouraging the performance, as though they were already entertained by the idea. To them, the request was a harmless game. The idea of a maid playing the piano for the wealthy seemed absurd, even funny. They expected fumbling fingers, awkward notes, a brief distraction before the evening moved on. The maid stood rooted to the spot. Her cheeks flushed, her heart racing. She clutched the tray tighter against her chest, wishing she could sink into the marble floor. She wasn't supposed to be seen like this. Her job was to blend in, to serve quietly, to stay invisible. Now the spotlight was on her, and she felt naked under it. She glanced at the piano, then back at the millionaire. His smirk told her this wasn't really a request. It was an order, dressed in laughter. She could hear whispers rising from the crowd. Can she even play? This should be good. I bet she's never touched a piano in her life. Her throat tightened. Part of her wanted to refuse, to shake her head and retreat into the safety of the kitchen. But another part, deep, quiet, but strong, held her still. Because she could play. The piano was not foreign to her. She had spent hours on one, alone in quiet rooms where no one was watching. She knew the feel of the keys under her fingertips, the way music could rise like fire or fall like water. She had played for herself, for her family, for God. It was a part of her life no one here knew, a secret gift hidden beneath her simple uniform. And now, with the entire room watching, she felt that secret pressing against her chest. The millionaire leaned back in his chair, satisfied with the attention his request had stirred. "Go on," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "Give us a show." The guests chuckled again, their eyes fixed on her. Some leaned forward eagerly, ready to laugh. Others smirked, already expecting failure. The maid's hands trembled as she set the tray down on a nearby table. She straightened slowly, her back stiff, her heart pounding so loudly she thought they might hear it. For a long second, she stood motionless, weighing her choice. She could refuse and face humiliation, or she could step forward and take the seat at the piano. She inhaled deeply, and then, with quiet steps, she began to move. The laughter softened into murmurs. Guests whispered to each other, some smirking, others curious now. The sound of her shoes clicking softly against the floor was the only noise in the room. She reached the piano and paused, her hands hovering above the keys. The polished surface reflected her face, pale and nervous but determined. She lowered herself onto the bench, the wood creaking under her weight. The guests leaned in, waiting. The millionaire smirked, sipping his wine. He thought he had given them something amusing, a joke to pass the time. But what none of them knew was that the moment her fingers touched the keys, the joke would vanish. The maid, invisible until now, was about to leave the room speechless. Maid sat at the grand piano, her back straight, but her hands frozen just above the keys. The polished surface reflected her trembling fingers, the chandelier's golden glow catching in her dark eyes. She could feel every gaze in the room pressing down on her like heavy stones. The laughter from earlier had died away, replaced by a hush of curiosity, but that silence was no kinder. It was the kind of silence that judged, that waited to see her fail. Her heart thudded so loudly in her chest that she thought the guests might hear it over the music that no one had yet played. Her mouth was dry, her throat tight. She had been invisible all evening, slipping between tables with trays, serving drinks with quiet grace. Now, suddenly, she was the center of everything. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her breath. Memories flickered in her mind. Nights in the old church, where the piano keys had been chipped and faded, but where she had poured her heart into melodies no one else heard. She remembered the small, cramped apartment where she sometimes hummed lullabies to comfort her younger brother, the way his tired eyes lit up at the sound of her voice. Music had always been her refuge, her secret, her soul. But here, in this glittering hall, surrounded by wealth and arrogance, it felt like a test she had never asked for. Behind her, she heard whispers. Does she even know how to play? This will be interesting. Maybe she'll just bang on the keys for us. The words pierced her, but she didn't turn around. She knew what they expected: clumsy fingers, awkward pauses, a performance to laugh about later over wine. They didn't see her as a musician. They didn't see her at all. Her fingers hovered closer to the keys, brushing them lightly, as if asking permission. The smooth ivory felt both familiar and foreign, as though it belonged to another world, the world of the guests, not hers. For a moment, she almost pulled her hands away, almost stood up, almost retreated back into the shadows where she was safe, unseen, silent. But then her eyes drifted across the room, and she caught the sight of something unexpected. Not everyone was smirking. Not everyone was waiting to laugh. A few guests leaned forward, their expressions softer, curious rather than cruel. One of the waiters stood in the back, watching with quiet encouragement in his eyes, and then she realized she wasn't only playing for them, she was playing for herself. Her breath slowed, her shoulders relaxed. She thought of her mother, humming in the kitchen as she cooked, her tired hands always moving, but her voice always full of warmth. She thought of her brother, who sometimes whispered to her, "Play for me, just one more time," because her music was the only thing that eased his worries. She thought of the nights when she sat alone, her fingers moving across the piano keys in the dim light, when the world felt heavy, but music lifted her above it. She couldn't walk away now. The millionaire leaned back in his chair, smirk still fixed on his face, swirling the wine in his glass. He thought he had given the room a joke, a spectacle, something to feed his pride. "Go on then," he said lightly, his tone dripping with amusement. "Don't keep us waiting." The words stung, but they also lit something inside her, a spark of defiance, a quiet strength. She wasn't here to entertain him. She wasn't here for their laughter. She was here because music lived in her, and it was time to let it speak. Her fingers finally rested on the keys. The cool touch of ivory sent a shiver through her, but it also grounded her. She let her palms relax, her shoulders loosen. She inhaled deeply, closing her eyes once more. The silence in the room deepened, heavy with anticipation. Guests leaned forward, wine glasses paused mid-air. The violinist who had performed earlier tilted her head, curious. The waitstaff stopped moving altogether, their trays hovering as they waited. The maid opened her eyes. For a second, doubt flickered again. What if she failed? What if her nerves betrayed her? What if the music she carried inside didn't come out the same way here, under all these eyes? But then she remembered what her mother once told her when she was small and nervous before singing in church. "Don't play for them, play for your soul. Let the music tell the truth." Her lips curved into the smallest of smiles. She lowered her head slightly, her fingers pressing gently into the first chord. The sound rang out, soft, pure, like a bell in the quiet night. The room shifted. Guests blinked, surprised. The laughter that had been ready on their lips froze. They had expected stumbling, noise, a joke. But what they heard was the beginning of something else, something real. The maid paused for just a breath, letting the note linger, letting her confidence rise. And then, with a steady exhale, her hands began to move. The hesitation was gone. What followed would leave the entire room breathless. The maid's fingers hovered for just one more second, the silence of the room so deep that even the clinking of glasses had stopped. All eyes were fixed on her, waiting, some with smirks, some with curiosity, some with pity. The millionaire leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine, already sure this would be nothing more than an amusing story to tell tomorrow. And then, the first note rang out. It was soft, delicate, almost hesitant, but it carried through the golden hall with surprising clarity. The sound was like a thread of light, weaving itself into the silence. Guests blinked, their expressions shifting. They had expected clumsy noise, fingers crashing against keys. But this was music. The maid let the note linger for a heartbeat, then pressed the next and the next. Slowly, carefully, she shaped the melody. Her hands began to move with more certainty, the rhythm flowing from her like water finding its course. The grand piano, untouched all evening, seemed to come alive under her touch. The polished black surface reflected her steady posture, her hair falling slightly forward as she bent into the music. The ivory keys gleamed under the chandelier, each one kissed by her fingers, as though they belonged to her. The guests leaned forward, the smirks on their faces fading into something else. Confusion at first, then awe. The laughter they had been holding back melted into silence. Even the whisperers stopped. The melody deepened, no longer hesitant but confident. It rose and fell, tender and strong, telling a story without words. It was not the rigid playing of someone who had been formally trained. It was raw, soulful, alive. Every note carried her heart, her memories, her struggles, her strength. She played like someone who had lived through pain but had chosen to turn it into beauty. The rhythm spoke of quiet nights, the chords of hidden tears, and the harmonies of hope that refused to die. The room began to change. The guests, who had come for fine wine and shallow laughter, now sat still, their eyes fixed on her. A woman in a red dress, her diamonds glittering, slowly lowered her glass to the table, her jaw slack in disbelief. A man near the fireplace leaned forward, his brows furrowed, as if trying to understand how such music could come from someone they had dismissed. The violinist, sitting quietly in the corner, placed her instrument gently on her lap, her lips parting in wonder. Even the millionaire, who had started the whole thing with arrogance, stopped smiling. His glass remained in his hand, but he had forgotten to drink. He stared at the maid, his eyes narrowing, not with mockery anymore, but with something else. Something he couldn't name. The music filled the mansion like a tide, rising and spreading until it touched every corner. It was no longer just sound. It was emotion, pressing into every chest, stirring hearts that had grown too used to comfort. And the maid, she forgot the room. As her fingers danced across the keys, the weight of the guests' stares fell away. She was no longer the maid in a uniform. She was no longer the invisible shadow moving between tables. She was herself, pure, alive, free. The music carried her away, and for the first time that night, she felt powerful. Her eyes closed briefly, her body swaying gently with the rhythm. She didn't think about who was watching or what they expected. She only thought about the song, the way it flowed through her veins like blood, the way it rose from a place so deep it could not be silenced. She struck a series of higher notes, quick and light, like laughter breaking through sadness. Then came the lower, heavier chords, steady and strong, like the beating of a heart that refuses to give up. Together, they painted a picture more vivid than any painting on the Millionaire's walls. The guests felt it. A woman near the front pressed her hand against her chest, tears glistening in her eyes. A man who had been whispering jokes earlier now sat stiff and silent, his gaze fixed firmly on her. Even the waitstaff, who had always seen her as one of their own, looked at her with new eyes, eyes that reflected pride and astonishment. The melody rose higher, stronger, as if reaching for something beyond the walls of the mansion. The chandelier above seemed to shimmer brighter, the air vibrating with every note. It was no longer a performance. It was a revelation. And when the music softened again, flowing like a river calming after a storm, the entire room leaned into it. The silence between the notes was heavy, sacred, as if no one dared even breathe too loudly. The maid's fingers slowed, her final chords echoing softly in the golden hall. The sound lingered long after her hands fell still, fading into silence like the last rays of sunset disappearing into night. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The guests sat frozen, staring at the woman they had barely noticed before, now unable to look away. The millionaire's lips parted slightly, his face pale with disbelief. He had asked her to play for amusement, expecting a joke, a trick, a distraction. Instead, she had given them something unforgettable. tea. Maid lowered her hands to her lap, her breathing slow and steady. She didn't look at the audience. She didn't need their approval. She had played not for them, but for herself, for her truth, and the truth had left the room speechless. For a long moment after the final chord faded, the grand hall was wrapped in silence. The chandelier still glittered, the wine still shimmered in crystal glasses, but no one moved, no one spoke. It was as if the room itself had stopped breathing. The maid sat at the piano, her hands resting gently in her lap. She did not bow. She did not smile. She simply sat still, her chest rising and falling quietly, her eyes lowered. She had played her heart out, and now she returned to the quiet dignity she had always carried. But the guests, they were no longer the same. The woman in the red dress who had been showing off her diamonds earlier now blinked rapidly, tears glistening in her eyes. She pressed a hand against her chest as though steadying her own heartbeat. Her laughter, which had been sharp and carefree minutes ago, was gone. In its place was awe. The group of businessmen near the fireplace, who had been whispering smug jokes when the maid first sat down, now leaned forward in stunned silence. One of them shook his head slowly, his lips parted as though he wanted to say something but couldn't. Another wiped his glasses with trembling hands, using the motion to hide the moisture in his eyes. The violinist, who had been hired to play background music earlier, now sat with her instrument untouched in her lap. Her lips curved into a smile, not one of mockery, but of admiration. She whispered softly to the man beside her, "That's not performance, that's soul." The waitstaff, scattered along the edges of the room, stood frozen with their trays in hand. They had always known her as one of their own, the quiet maid who moved gracefully through the house. Now they looked at her as if seeing her for the very first time. Their eyes shone with pride, their backs straightened, their hearts swelling. She had done what none of them dared to do. She had stepped into the center of the world that ignored them, and she had owned it. And then there was the millionaire. He sat at the head of the table, his glass of wine untouched, his smirk wiped clean from his face. His brows were furrowed, his lips parted slightly, his gaze fixed firmly on the maid. He had asked her to play for amusement, expecting a joke, a clumsy distraction, a reminder of his power. Instead, she had shattered his arrogance with beauty. She had turned his careless order into a lesson that reached deeper than his wealth ever could. For the first time in a long time, the millionaire was speechless. The silence stretched, heavy and powerful, and then, slowly, it broke. A man near the front began to clap, softly at first, hesitant, almost shy. His hands echoed against the marble walls, each sound sharp and clear. Then another joined, then another. Within seconds, the hall was filled with applause. Not polite applause, not forced or shallow. It was real, deep, grateful. The guests rose to their feet, their clapping growing louder, rising like thunder, until the whole mansion shook with it. Some whistled, others cheered. The woman in red wiped tears from her cheeks as she clapped furiously, her diamonds forgotten. The violinist stood, bowing her head toward the maid with respect. Even the staff, though usually reserved, allowed themselves to smile, to clap, to let pride wash over them. The maid lifted her eyes, startled by the sound. She had not expected this. She had not played for their approval, for their applause. She had played because music lived inside her, because the piano had asked her to tell the truth she carried. But now, seeing their faces, hearing their hands, she felt something stir in her chest. A warmth, a recognition she had never experienced in this house before. She rose slowly from the piano bench, her movements calm, humble. She did not bow or boast. She simply placed her hands together, nodding once, her expression modest. And still, the applause roared on. The millionaire remained seated, his hands motionless, but his eyes were different now. The arrogance had faded, replaced by something quieter, shock, respect, perhaps even shame. For the first time that evening, he looked not at the maid's uniform, not at her role, but at her, at the woman who had silenced a room of the wealthiest people he knew with nothing but her gift. A guest whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "I've been to concerts all over the world, but nothing has ever touched me like that." Another replied softly, "Talent like that doesn't belong in the shadows." The words spread, carried by whispers, weaving between the applause. And slowly, the truth sank in for everyone present. They had underestimated her. They had judged her by her uniform, her status, her silence. But tonight, she had revealed herself, not as a maid, but as an artist, a soul far greater than the labels placed on her. The applause finally began to fade, leaving behind a reverent hush. The guests exchanged glances, their faces softer, their hearts humbled. No one would forget what they had just witnessed. The maid stepped back from the piano, ready to return to her work, ready to disappear into the background once more. But she would not be the same, and neither would they. For in that hall of wealth and arrogance, she had taught them a lesson more valuable than gold. Greatness cannot be measured by riches, and dignity cannot be hidden forever. The applause still echoed through the mansion, rolling like thunder against marble floors and crystal walls. Guests clapped with fervor, some even cheering aloud, their faces glowing with amazement. But the millionaire did not join them. He sat motionless at the head of the table, his wine glass resting untouched in his hand, his gaze fixed on the maid. For the first time that evening, his smirk was gone. The careless laughter he carried like a weapon had vanished. His posture, usually straight and commanding, seemed to sag slightly as though the weight of what he had just witnessed pressed down on his shoulders. He looked around at his guests, people he had entertained countless times before with food, wine, and wealth, and realized that tonight he had been upstaged, and not by another millionaire, not by a famous artist, but by his maid. He tried to swallow the knot in his throat, but it stayed lodged there. He had expected clumsy fingers, broken notes, maybe even a moment of humiliation to share with his guests later. Instead, she had played with such mastery, such soul, that she had taken the night away from him. The mansion was his, the piano was his, even the people in the room were, in a sense, his, bound to his wealth, his status, his invitations. Yet the applause, the awe, the respect, they weren't for him. They were for her, and that shook him. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied her. She stood beside the piano now, her head bowed modestly, her hands clasped in front of her. She didn't bask in the applause, didn't demand recognition. Her humility only deepened the respect she commanded. She wasn't trying to steal his spotlight. She had simply let her truth speak, and in doing so, she had silenced his power. The millionaire felt something he hadn't felt in years. Small. His mind flashed back to his own past. As a young man, he had once dreamed of being admired not for his money, but for his talent. He had worked hard, yes, but he had also built his fortune with arrogance, with deals that valued profit over people. Somewhere along the way, he had forgotten what it meant to create something beautiful, something real. Watching the maid pour herself into the piano reminded him of the things he had lost, the purity of passion, the dignity of honest expression. The applause around him swelled again, pulling him out of his thoughts. He clenched his jaw, torn between pride and humiliation. Part of him wanted to laugh it off, to turn it into a joke, to reclaim control of the room with another booming toast. But he couldn't. The sound of her music still lingered in his chest, echoing louder than his ego. He noticed the faces of his guests. Their eyes no longer looked at him as the center of the night. They were still glancing toward the maid, whispering in awe, shaking their heads in disbelief. Some of them even looked at him differently, less impressed, almost questioning, as though silently asking, "Why did you treat her as a joke? Didn't you know what treasure was standing in front of you?" For the first time in years, the millionaire felt exposed. He shifted in his chair, lifting the glass of wine to his lips just to have something to do with his hands. But when he took a sip, the flavor felt flat, dull, meaningless. Nothing could erase the image of her at the piano, eyes closed, fingers moving as though the instrument had been built for her alone. He placed the glass down with more force than necessary, the sharp clink echoing in the sudden quiet between applause. A few guests turned toward him, curious at his reaction. He forced a small smile, but it was weak, hollow. Inside, he was battling emotions he didn't want anyone to see: shame, respect, even envy. Because the truth was undeniable, she had something he could never buy. His millions could build houses, fill tables, buy art, and command attention. But they could not create what she had given tonight. Her music was priceless, born not of wealth but of spirit, and that was something beyond his reach. The maid, still standing humbly, finally lifted her gaze. Their eyes met across the golden hall. For a moment, the millionaire felt stripped of everything: his suit, his wealth, his pride. He felt as though she could see him for what he really was: a man who had mistaken money for meaning, power for respect. And in that gaze, he felt something unexpected. Not anger, not defiance, but forgiveness. She wasn't mocking him. She wasn't claiming victory. She was simply herself, dignified, calm, unshaken by his arrogance. That humility cut deeper than any challenge could have. The millionaire leaned back in his chair, his chest rising with a heavy sigh. Around him the applause began to fade, replaced by murmurs of amazement. Guests leaned toward one another, speaking in hushed voices about the maid's brilliance, their words carrying admiration he wished was directed at him. But it wasn't. It was hers. And though he struggled to accept it, a quiet truth began to take root in his mind. Perhaps tonight wasn't about him at all.